In today's episode of the podcast, we are thinking about what spills out when you're shaken. Now, all this week, we've been celebrating and encouraging and asking you to be more weird, to embrace your inner weirdo. And today's episode is potentially a little bit more challenging because I purposely spent at least 2 episodes this week reminding you of how wonderful you are, reminding you that God is singing songs about you. The challenge is to look at those times when we are hard pressed. Now, I don't necessarily mean that you're going to be literally shaken or bumped into, but what I felt, the picture I had in mind was like if I'm carrying a cup of coffee and someone was to nudge into me with that cup of coffee, what would spill out the top would be coffee because the cup was full of coffee. And so the challenge for us is when we're up against it, when something bumps into us, probably metaphorically speaking, what spills out? And ideally, most of the time, patience and goodness and grace are the things that spill out. Love, kindness, goodness. But the challenge I want to offer you is to start to pay attention to what spills out when you are shaken and hard pressed and given a shove. And if you don't like what comes out, then there's work to do. And I mean that with all the kindness and loveness, with all the kindness and all the love in the world. And I'm speaking to myself as much as you. I'm speaking to me and to you because we're all human. You know, we live in a world where we're not going to get it right all of the time. That said, I do believe there's an onus on us to be aware of how we're moving through the world. And so I couldn't really end the week without at least touching on this. I'm not going to touch on it very heavily. I like to keep things light and sunshiny and delightful. But, you know, we have to have these hard conversations too, because otherwise if I only give you the easy stuff, then I'm doing you a disservice because you're better than that. You are perfectly capable of examining, and if things aren't quite how you want them to be, to start considering, okay, what can we do about this? I'll give you it's a really random example, but it's a very true example. I remember when I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I can't have been older than 12 because when we now live in West Wales, but we moved to Wales when I was 11 or 12. And prior to that, we lived in Hampshire. And I have this very clear memory of one time in like a Friday night youth club type setting, although I must have been a very young youth person because the oldest I was 12. And there was a girl called Lorraine who was 16, and I really looked up to Lorraine. And I don't know where Lorraine is today. I haven't heard from her or spoken to her in years. But something, I can't remember what she said. All I remember is somebody saying something and me going, "Oh, bloody hell," and the words slipping out of my mouth and the look of horror on her face because I was in church and I said, "Bloody hell," because that I had got so used to using that language, not in front of my parents. They probably never even heard this story maybe until today if they listen to the podcast. But I got so used to using that language. And of course, it's not the worst thing I could have said. I wasn't effing and jeffing, but it wasn't really the appropriate thing to be saying in a church setting. Let's just say that. And like I say, I still remember to this day, years and years later, her shock that the phrase bloody hell should have slipped out of my mouth. But slipped out of my mouth is the key expression. I'd been bumped or shoved or knocked into in some way. I don't remember what happened, but something happened. And that's what spilled out. And that stuck with me because it reminds me that when we are hard pressed, when we are bumped and shoved, we're told that we are new creations. The old is gone, but we still live in a world where bad stuff happens. And so these two different ideas kind of do battle with each other. Like, how is it that Paul can say, you are a new creation, the old is gone, the new has come, and yet I'm still grumpy? Like, if what Paul is saying is right and I'm a new creation, why do I get it wrong sometimes? And that's just the reality of living as humans in the world today, until such time as, Jesus comes back and all that sort of stuff. That's the reality of where we are right now. And even though those realities bump into each other and almost seem to contradict each other, that doesn't mean that we can't try and live in a way that when we are hard pressed, when we are bumped into, that goodness comes out and loveliness comes out. And so I want to challenge you, I guess, at the end of this week, just to start paying attention. Because if you're not going to get it right all of the time, and I don't want you to start giving yourself a hard time, beating yourself up, because particularly as women, we're really good at noticing those times when we do it wrong, and noticing and giving ourselves a hard time and feeling guilty. But what I would encourage you to do is to start looking out for patterns. And if you're noticing a pattern that you don't like very much, what can you do to tweak it? So, like, a stupid random example for me is toast. I eat far too much toast. And so I noticed I was eating too much toast, and toast wasn't very good for me, and noticed a pattern. And so I tried to cut back on it. I offer that as a light and silly random example because I like to keep these episodes light. But humor is my way of sharing the challenging stuff with you. So there is a real challenge behind that. And if this is something that you would like some help with, if you want to chat about it more, book a time for us to chat, faithandbusinessplayground.com/talk. But I would though end this episode and this week's worth of focusing on Weirdo Week by reminding you that God is singing songs about you. Even when that phrase bloody hell slipped out of my mouth, even those times when I'm grumpy, even the times when I eat too much toast, God is still singing songs of delight about me. And even those times when you get it wrong, and even those times when you're grumpy with the children, and even those times when you're snappy, God is still singing songs of delight about you. That's what grace is about. There is nothing that you can do to make God love you more, but there's also nothing you can do that will make God love you any less. And that's the takeaway from the whole week, really, ultimately, is it is about love. And that won't be the first time I remind you of this, because love is, as I've said before, the whole Bible is a love story. So yes, take some time to notice the patterns and to reflect and do the work if you need to tweak stuff. But ultimately, remember that you are loved. God is delighting over you with singing. You are brilliant and wonderful and made in the image of God. As ever, thank you for listening. It's been my pleasure and delight. If you're not subscribed, do please subscribe, and I shall be back next time. Take care. Bye-bye.